I thought love was not for me anymore. That is what Elena Caruso whispered to herself every single morning as she unlocked the door of the small cafe on Mulberry Street in Lower Manhattan. She believed those words with the certainty of someone who had learned them through years of quiet disappointment and silent tears shed in the dark of her tiny apartment above the bakery next door. At 42 years old, Eleanor had convinced herself that her chapter of romance had closed permanently, sealed, shut by the weight of a divorce that had left her emotionally bankrupt and a series of betrayals that had taught her to expect nothing from anyone. She was wrong. She simply did not know it yet. The morning air carried the scent of fresh rain as Eleanor flipped the sign on the glass door from closed to open. November in New York had arrived with its characteristic bite, the kind of cold that seeped through wool coats and settled into bones. She moved through her familiar routine with the precision of someone who had performed these same actions for 7 years straight. Coffee grounds measured and poured, espresso machine heated and humming, pastries arranged in the display case with the care of an artist positioning sculptures in a gallery. The cafe was her sanctuary, her hiding place from a world that had proven itself untrustworthy. She called it Café Serenita, a name that had belonged to her grandmother's small kitchen in Naples before Elena's family had immigrated to America when she was just a child. The walls were painted a warm terracotta, decorated with black and white photographs of Italian coastlines and handwritten recipes framed in simple wood. Every detail had been chosen by Eleanor herself, each element a small rebellion against the sterile corporate world she had escaped when her marriage collapsed and took her previous life with it. The first customers began trickling in around 6:30. Construction workers seeking strong espresso before their shifts, young professionals clutching laptops and desperate expressions, elderly couples from the neighborhood who had been coming since Elena first opened the doors. She knew their names, their orders, their stories. Mrs. Benedetto always wanted her cappuccino extra hot with 3 sugars. Mr. Park from the dry cleaning shop preferred his Americano black and bitter, just like his sense of humor. These small connections sustained Elena, gave her days meaning even when the loneliness of her nights threatened to swallow her whole. It was on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November, when everything changed. Eleanor noticed him immediately because he was impossible to ignore. He walked through the door at precisely 7:15, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples, his jaw sharp and shadowed with stubble that suggested he had not slept. But it was his eyes that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. They were grey, the color of storm clouds gathering over the Hudson River, and they carried a weight that she recognized instantly. It was the weight of someone who had seen too much, lost too much, survived too much. He approached the counter with measured steps, his presence filling the small space in a way that made the other customers unconsciously shift away. There was an authority in his movements, a controlled power that spoke of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Elena felt her heart rate increase and silently scolded herself for the reaction. She was too old for this, too damaged, too wise to be affected by a handsome stranger in an expensive coat. His voice was low and smooth when he spoke. "Just black coffee, please, large." Elena nodded and turned to prepare his order, grateful for the excuse to look away from those penetrating eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the coffee, and she prayed he would not notice. She turned back to hand him the cup. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt a jolt of electricity that made her nearly drop the drink. $3, she managed to say, proud that her voice remained steady. He placed a $20 bill on the counter. "Keep the change." Before Elena could protest, he had taken his coffee and moved to a small table in the corner, positioning himself with his back to the wall and a clear view of both the entrance and the large windows facing the street. It was the seat of someone who needed to see danger coming, she realized, the seat of someone who expected it. He stayed for exactly 1 hour. Elena watched him from behind the counter, pretending to clean already spotless surfaces while stealing glances at this mysterious man who sat perfectly still, drinking his coffee in small measured sips and watching the world pass by outside the window. He did not check his phone. He did not read a newspaper. He simply sat and observed with the patience of a predator waiting for prey. When he finally rose to leave, he paused at the counter and met Elena's eyes directly. "Thank you," he said. "The coffee is excellent." Then he was gone, leaving behind only the $20 bill and a strange electricity that lingered in the air long after the door had closed behind him. Elena told herself it meant nothing. Wealthy men passed through the neighborhood occasionally, slumming it in search of authentic experiences before returning to their penthouses and private clubs. He would not come back. Men like that never did. But he did come back. The next morning, at precisely 7:15, he walked through the door again. Same overcoat, same measured steps, same storm-grey eyes that found Elena immediately and held her gaze for a moment that stretched into eternity. "Black coffee large," she said before he could order. He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth twitched upward for the briefest instant before settling back into its stern line. "You remembered." Elena shrugged, aiming for casual indifference and probably failing miserably. "It is my job to remember." He took his coffee to the same corner table and repeated his ritual of silent observation. 1 hour exactly. $20 bill on the counter. A quiet thank you before disappearing into the grey November morning. This pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every morning, without exception, he arrived at 7:15. Every morning, Eleanor had his coffee ready before he reached the counter. Every morning their interaction lasted no more than 30 seconds, yet those brief moments became the axis around which Elena's days began to rotate. She learned things about him through observation rather than conversation. He was left-handed. He took his coffee black but preferred it when she used the Italian roast instead of the regular blend. He was protective of his privacy, always positioning his phone face down on the table. He was respected, possibly feared, given the way. Other men sometimes nodded to him on the street, with a deference that bordered on submission. Most importantly, she noticed that despite his intimidating presence, he was unfailingly polite. He said please and thank you. He never raised his voice. He treated her with a quiet respect that many of her regular customers failed to offer. It was Mrs. Benedetto who finally told Elena what she should have guessed from the beginning. The elderly woman leaned across the counter one morning after the mysterious stranger had departed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Do you know who that man is?" she whispered. "That is Dominic Marchetti." The name meant nothing to Elena, and her confusion must have shown on her face. Mrs. Benedetto crossed herself quickly. "The Marchetti family, child. They have controlled this part of the city for 3 generations. He is the boss now. The Don. They say he inherited the position 5 years ago when his father passed." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard whispers about organized crime in the neighborhood, of course, everyone had, but she had always kept her head down, minded her own business, stayed invisible. The thought that she had been serving coffee to a Mafia boss every morning for 2 weeks made her knees weak. "He seems to like you," Mrs. Benedetto continued, her tone equal parts warning and wonder. "Be careful, Elena. Men like him, they take what they want, and they do not let go easily." That night, Elena lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the water-stained ceiling and trying to convince herself to end this before it began. She would tell him the cafe was closing. She would hire someone else to work the morning shift. She would do anything to avoid the dangerous path that seemed to be opening before her feet. But when 7:15 arrived the next morning and the door opened to reveal Dominic Marchetti in his charcoal overcoat, Elena found herself unable to speak the words of dismissal. She had rehearsed all night. Instead, she simply poured his coffee and accepted his $20 bill and watched him take his usual seat in the corner. She was in trouble, deep, terrifying, exhilarating trouble, and some reckless part of her that she had thought long dead was actually looking forward to seeing where this would lead. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you have ever felt your heart race at a story that promises danger and redemption, if you have ever believed that love can appear in the most unexpected places, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now and never miss a moment of these journeys that speak directly to the soul. 3 weeks after Dominic Marchetti first walked into Café Serenità, Elena finally gathered the courage to speak more than a simple greeting. It was a rainy morning, the kind that kept most customers home and left the café eerily quiet. When Dominic entered at his usual time, water dripping from his dark hair and his overcoat spotted with rain, Elena found herself saying words she had not planned. "You are going to catch cold," she heard herself say. "Let me make you something warm, something more than just black coffee." Dominic paused, surprise flickering briefly across his normally impassive features. He seemed to consider her offer for a moment before nodding slowly. "What would you recommend?" Elena moved before she could second-guess herself, preparing a traditional Italian hot chocolate the way her grandmother had taught her decades ago, thick and rich, almost like a warm pudding with a touch of cinnamon and orange zest. She could feel his eyes on her as she worked, and her skin prickled with awareness. When she placed the cup before him, their eyes met, and Elena saw something in those grey depths that made her breath catch. It was vulnerability, carefully hidden, but unmistakably present. This man who commanded an empire, who held the power of life and death in his hands, was looking at her as though she held something precious that he desperately wanted, but did not know how to ask for. "My grandmother used to make this," she explained softly, "on cold mornings in Naples, before we came to America. She said it could warm even the coldest heart." Dominic lifted the cup to his lips and took a slow sip. When he lowered it, there was a genuine smile on his face, small but real, and it transformed him completely. He looked younger suddenly, softer, like a man who had once known joy, before the world had taught him to guard against it. "It is perfect," he said. And then, after a pause that seemed to cost him something, "My mother used to make something similar, before she passed." It was the first personal information he had ever shared, and Elena treasured it like a rare gift. "I am sorry for your loss." Dominic nodded, his jaw tightening briefly before he regained control. "It was a long time ago. I was 18. The same age I was when I lost my father," Elena heard herself say. The words emerged without permission, drawn out by some inexplicable connection that seemed to exist between them. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the counter, two people who had learned too young that the world could be cruel, and that loss was the price of loving. Then Dominic glanced down at his hot chocolate, and the moment passed, but something had shifted between them. Some invisible barrier had cracked. He stayed longer than usual that morning, nearly 2 hours, and when he finally rose to leave, he paused at the counter instead of simply walking out. Elena. It was the first time he had said her name, and the sound of it in his low voice made her shiver. "I would like to know more about Naples, about your grandmother, if you would be willing to share." She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Tomorrow then," he said, and was gone. Elena spent that night unable to sleep, torn between terror and anticipation. She researched Dominic Marchetti online and found almost nothing, just a few mentions of charitable donations and real estate holdings, nothing that confirmed or denied Mrs. Benedetto's claims about his criminal empire. Either he was very private or very protected. Probably both. She should run. Everything logical in her brain screamed that she should put distance between herself and this dangerous man before it was too late. But her heart, that treacherous organ she had thought permanently scarred, whispered something different. It whispered that she had seen loneliness in his eyes that matched her own. It whispered that perhaps two broken people might somehow make each other whole. The following weeks established a new routine. Dominic still arrived at 7:15, but now he stayed until 9 or sometimes later. Eleanor would prepare his coffee, and then, when the morning rush subsided, she would join him at his corner table. They talked about small things at first, favorite books and films, memories of childhood before everything became complicated, dreams they had abandoned and dreams they still secretly harbored. She learned that he had studied architecture before family obligations pulled him in a different direction, that he loved classical music, particularly Chopin, and attended the Philharmonic alone once a month, because his wife had died 8 years ago, and he had never found anyone else he wanted to share that experience with. He learned that she had once wanted to be a painter, but had given up the dream when her ex-husband convinced her that her work was not good enough, that she had spent 15 years in a marriage that slowly eroded her sense of self until she was nothing but an echo of the woman she had once been, that the café was her attempt to rebuild from the ashes. They never discussed his business. It was an unspoken agreement between them, a boundary that Elena was grateful for, because it allowed her to maintain the illusion that she was simply getting to know a complicated but fundamentally good man. She needed that illusion. She needed to believe that whatever was growing between them was not tainted by the darkness that lurked at the edges of his life. One morning in early December, Dominic arrived looking more tired than usual, shadows under his eyes and tension in his shoulders. Eleanor prepared his coffee without asking and watched him settle into his corner seat with movements that seemed weighted by invisible burdens. "Bad night?" she asked when she brought his cup to the table. He looked up at her, and for a moment his carefully maintained facade cracked completely. She saw exhaustion there, and grief, and a loneliness so profound that it took her breath away. "There are days when I question every choice I have ever made," he said quietly, "days when I wonder if the path I am on leads anywhere worth going." Elena sat down across from him without being invited, something she had never done before. "We all have those days. The important thing is that you keep walking anyway. Do you believe that, Elena? That there is something worth walking toward?" She considered the question seriously, knowing that he deserved more than a glib answer. "I believe that we cannot see the destination until we are almost there. I believe that sometimes the path changes us in ways we do not expect, and by the time we arrive, we are not the same people who started the journey. So maybe the question is not whether the destination is worth reaching, but whether we like who we are becoming along the way." Dominic stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his grey eyes. "You are remarkable," he said finally. "Do you know that?" Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am a middle-aged woman who makes coffee for a living. That is not remarkable. You see people," he said, "you really see them. Not many people bother to look beneath the surface anymore. They see what they expect to see, what is convenient, what is safe. But you, Elena Caruso, you see the truth. That is the most remarkable thing in the world." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm and slightly rough, and Eleanor felt that electric current pass between them again, stronger now than it had been that first morning when their fingers had brushed over a coffee cup. "I know what people say about me," Dominic continued, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I know what you probably suspect. I am not going to pretend to be something I am not, Elena. My life is complicated. My family has a complicated history, but I need you to understand something." He squeezed her hand gently. "When I walk through that door every morning, I am not the man the world thinks I am. I am just Dominic. Tired, lonely, searching for something I am not even sure exists anymore. And then I see you. And for a little while, I remember what it felt like to be hopeful. That is why I keep coming back. Not the coffee. You." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. She had spent so many years convincing herself that she was invisible, unworthy of attention, past the age when anyone would look at her and see something worth pursuing. And here was this man, this powerful, dangerous, complicated man, telling her that she was his reason to hope. "I am afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "of what this could mean, of what it could cost. I have already lost so much, Dominic. I do not know if I can survive losing anything else. Then we will be afraid together," he said, "and we will make sure neither of us has to lose anything ever again." It was a promise he had no right to make, and Elena knew it. But in that moment, with his hand warm around hers and his grey eyes holding nothing but sincerity, she chose to believe him. That evening, after the café closed, Dominic returned. He knocked on the side door that led to Elena's apartment, and when she opened it, she found him standing in the cold December air with a bouquet of white roses in his hands. "I know. This is not proper," he said. I should court you slowly, take you to dinner, do things in the correct order. But I have spent my entire life doing what is expected, and it has brought me nothing but emptiness. Tonight I do not want to be proper. I want to sit with you, drink wine, and talk until we run out of words. Can we do that, Elena, just for tonight?" She stepped aside to let him in. Her apartment was small, just a bedroom, bathroom, and combined living space that served as kitchen and sitting area. But she had decorated it with care, filling it with warm colors and soft textures that made it feel like a refuge from the outside world. Dominic looked around with apparent appreciation, his eyes landing on the easel in the corner, the one Elena kept covered with a cloth because she had not painted in years. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward it. Elena hesitated, then nodded. She watched him cross the room and lift the cloth, revealing an unfinished canvas. It was a portrait she had started of her grandmother years ago before the divorce, before she had stopped believing in her own talent. "This is beautiful," Dominic said softly. "Why did you stop?" Elena wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly vulnerable in a way she had not felt in a very long time. "My ex-husband said I was wasting my time, that I would never be good enough to sell anything. Eventually, I stopped trying." Dominic replaced the cloth gently and turned to face her, his expression hard with barely suppressed anger. He was a fool. "This work has soul, it has truth. Those are things that cannot be taught or bought." He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "Elena, I am going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it. You are not the woman your husband made you believe you were. You are not invisible, you are not unworthy. You are not past the time when good things can happen. He was small and afraid, and he made you small so he would not have to face his own inadequacy. But you are not small, you are extraordinary, and I will spend the rest of my life reminding you of that if you let me." Eleanor felt the tears spill down her cheeks, years of pain and self-doubt breaking loose all at once. Dominic pulled her into his arms and held her while she wept, his hand stroking her hair and his voice murmuring soft reassurances in Italian that she barely understood but felt in her bones. When the tears finally subsided, she pulled back and looked up at him. "Who are you, Dominic? Marchetti? Who are you really?" "I'm a man who has done things he is not proud of," he answered honestly. "A man who inherited a world he did not ask for and has tried to navigate it without losing himself completely. I am not innocent, Elena. I will never pretend to be. But I am also not the monster that people fear. I am just a man looking for reasons to be better. And you make me want to be better." She should have asked more questions. She should have demanded specifics about his business, his methods, his crimes. But Elena had spent too many years living in carefully constructed safety to remain there now. She wanted to feel alive. She wanted to take a risk. She wanted to believe that redemption was possible, even for men who lived in shadows. "Stay," she said. "Not for anything other than talking, just stay." Dominic smiled, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They talked until 3 in the morning, sharing a bottle of wine and stories that neither of them had told anyone else. Elena learned about his daughter, Sophia, who was 16 and attended boarding school in Connecticut because Dominic wanted her far from the complications of his life. She learned about his brother Marco, who handled the legitimate side of the family business and who constantly pushed Dominic to step away from their darker operations. She learned that Dominic had been quietly transitioning the family toward legal enterprises for the past 5 years, slowly unwinding decades of criminal involvement because he did not want his daughter to inherit the same burdens. In return, Elena shared the truth about her marriage. The emotional manipulation that had started so subtly, she did not recognize it until she was drowning. The way her husband had isolated her from friends and family convinced her that she was lucky he tolerated her mediocrity. The final discovery of his multiple affairs that had given her the strength to finally leave. The 3 years of therapy it had taken to even begin recognizing her own worth. By the time Dominic left as the first light of dawn began to color the sky, Elena felt as though she had been cracked open and reassembled into something new, something stronger, something more complete. "You should sleep," he said at the door, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I will see you at 7:15. Elena smiled through her exhaustion. "I will have your coffee ready." He paused, one hand on the doorframe, and looked back at her with an expression that made her heart stutter. "I have not felt this way in a very long time, Elena, not since my wife. I need you to know that this is not casual for me. This is not something I do. This is real. You are real. And I do not intend to let you go." "Then do not," she said simply. He nodded once and disappeared into the cold morning air, leaving Elena standing in her doorway with the taste of wine on her lips and the feeling that her entire life had just pivoted towards something she had stopped believing in years ago. Love. Dangerous, terrifying, utterly impossible love. And she was going to embrace it with both arms, consequences be damned. Christmas approached with the relentless cheerfulness that New York City seemed to specialize in during the holiday season. Store windows burst with elaborate displays. Street musicians played carols on every corner. The scent of roasted chestnuts mixed with exhaust fumes and expensive perfume as crowds filled the sidewalks in search of gifts and celebration. For Elena, this December felt different from any she had experienced in the past decade. There was a lightness in her step that surprised her, a smile that appeared on her face without conscious effort. The café was busier than ever, but she moved through the increased demands with energy she had forgotten she possessed. Love, she was discovering, was a remarkable fuel. Dominic continued his daily visits, but their relationship had evolved beyond coffee and conversation. He appeared in the evenings now, too, sometimes cooking dinner in her tiny kitchen, while she watched in amazement at his culinary skills. He brought her small gifts that showed he was paying attention. A set of expensive paints and brushes that appeared after she mentioned missing the smell of oil and turpentine, a first-edition book of poetry by her favorite Italian author, a cashmere blanket in exactly the shade of blue she had once mentioned loving as a child. More importantly, he brought his whole self. The man who appeared at her door each evening was not the controlled, intimidating figure who commanded respect through the mere fact of his presence. He was Dominic, tired sometimes, frustrated sometimes, tender always. He shared his worries about Sophia, who was struggling with her identity and her complicated feelings about the family legacy. He admitted his fears about the transition away from criminal enterprise, the enemies it created, and the loyalties it tested. Elena listened, without judgment, offering support without trying to fix things that were not hers to fix. She was learning that love was not about solving each other's problems. It was about standing beside each other while facing them. It was about making sure the other person knew they were not alone. One evening, a week before Christmas, Dominic arrived at the café looking more troubled than Elena had ever seen him. He ordered his usual coffee but barely touched it, staring out the window at the festive lights with an expression that bordered on grief. Elena waited until the last customer had left before approaching his table. "Talk to me." He looked up, and she saw the weight of worlds in his grey eyes. "It is Marco, my brother. He is demanding that I accelerate the transition. He wants us completely legitimate by the end of next year. He has threatened to take his concerns to people who should not be involved if I do not comply. Can you do that? Go legitimate that quickly." Dominic ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. Perhaps, but the speed creates risks. There are partners who will not accept being pushed out, people who have invested in certain outcomes. If I move too fast, I create enemies who will not simply disappear. They will look for leverage, for vulnerabilities. His eyes met hers, and Elena understood suddenly what he was not saying. She was the vulnerability. Their relationship made her a target. "The smart thing, Dominic," continued, his voice rough, "would be to end this, to protect you by staying away. Every morning when I walk through that door, I know I am being selfish. I know the danger I am bringing into your life just by being here." Elena reached across the table and took his hand, the same gesture he had made weeks ago when everything between them had begun to shift. "Do you remember what you told me that night in my apartment? About wanting to be better. About me making you want to be better." He nodded, silently. "I feel the same way about you, Dominic. For years I lived in fear. Fear of being hurt, fear of being seen, fear of wanting things I thought I did not deserve. You have shown me that I can be brave, that I can take risks, that life is worth living even when it is complicated and dangerous. She squeezed his hand. I do not want safety if it means giving up what we have found together. I want you, all of you, including the complications. For a long moment, Dominic simply looked at her, something shifting in his expression like clouds parting to reveal sun. Then he rose from his seat, circled the table, and pulled her into his arms. I do not deserve you, he murmured against her hair, but I am too selfish to let you go. Then stop trying, she replied, and kiss me. He did. Right there in her café, surrounded by the scent of espresso and the twinkling of Christmas lights, Dominic Marchetti kissed Elena Caruso with a tenderness that made her knees weak and her heart sore. It was their first real kiss, and it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. When they finally separated, both breathing unsteadily, Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. I want to meet Sophia. If we are doing this, really doing this, I want to know your daughter. Dominic pulled back slightly, searching her face. Are you sure? She is protective of me. It might not be easy. Nothing worth having ever is, Elena said, and your daughter is part of who you are. I cannot love all of you without knowing her. Something softened in Dominic's expression, a vulnerability that made him look years younger. Christmas Eve. She's coming home from school for the holidays. We have dinner at the estate. Would you join us? Elena felt a flutter of nerves but pushed through it. I would be honored. She spent the next week in alternating states of excitement and terror. Meeting the daughter of the man she was falling in love with felt monumental, a step that could not be taken back. She bought a new dress, simple but elegant, in a deep burgundy that suited her olive complexion. She practiced what she would say, imagined every possible scenario, and drove herself half crazy with anticipation. On Christmas Eve, Dominic sent a car for her, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows, and a driver who spoke only to give her a respectful greeting before merging into holiday traffic. The drive took 40 minutes, leading out of Manhattan and into the wealthy suburbs of New Jersey, where the houses grew larger and more secluded with each mile. The Marchetti estate was not what Elena had expected. She had imagined something ostentatious, a monument to wealth and power designed to intimidate. Instead, she found herself being driven through iron gates toward a gracious older home built in the Italian Renaissance style. It was large, certainly, but there was a warmth to it. Gardens and fountains and a circular driveway that spoke of generations rather than new money. Dominic met her, at the door himself, dressed in a charcoal sweater and dark trousers that made him look both elegant and approachable. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her cheek. You look beautiful, he said. Come in. Sophia is eager to meet you. Eleanor somehow doubted that was true, but she squared her shoulders and allowed herself to be led inside. The interior of the house was exactly as she would have imagined Dominic's home. Rich wood tones, antique furniture that looked both valuable and comfortable, walls covered with artwork that ranged from Renaissance masters to modern abstracts. A Christmas tree stood in the corner of the great room, decorated with ornaments that clearly held sentimental value rather than designer perfection. And there, standing by the fireplace with her arms crossed and her chin lifted in challenge, was Sophia Marchetti. She had her father's grey eyes and her late mother's delicate bone structure. At 16, she was beautiful in the way that promised even greater beauty to come, but her expression was hard, defensive, the look of a girl who had learned to protect herself from disappointment. Sophia, Dominic said, this is Elena Caruso. The girl looked Elena up and down with the brutal assessment that only teenagers seemed capable of delivering. You own the coffee shop? I do, Elena confirmed, refusing to be intimidated. My father talks about you, constantly. Sophia's tone implied this was not a compliment. I talk about him too, Elena replied evenly. He is. Quite remarkable. Something flickered in Sophia's eyes, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect. She uncrossed her arms slightly. He said you paint. I used to. I am trying to start again. I paint too. Sophia's voice lost some of its edge. My mother taught me before she got sick. Eleanor felt the shift, the tiny opening that the girl was offering despite herself. I would love to see your work sometime, if you were willing to share. Sophia glanced at her father, who was watching the exchange with barely concealed hope, and something in her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Maybe. We will see. It was not a warm welcome, but it was not rejection either. Eleanor counted it as a victory. Dinner was a careful dance of getting to know each other. Elena asked Sophia about school, about her plans for the future, about her favorite subjects. The girl answered in short sentences at first, clearly testing whether Elena's interest was genuine or performative. But as the meal progressed and Elena demonstrated real curiosity, Sophia began to open up. She talked about her love of art history, her frustration with the social politics of boarding school, her complicated feelings about being a Marchetti in a world that both feared and envied her family name. By the time dessert was served, Elena found herself genuinely liking this prickly, protective, secretly vulnerable girl. And based on the looks Sophia was giving her father, the feeling might even be mutual. After dinner, Dominic walked Elena through the gardens despite the cold, their breath forming clouds in the night air. The grounds were illuminated with tasteful Christmas lights, creating a magical atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of normal time. "She liked you," Dominic said, wonder in his voice. "Sophia does not like anyone easily. She is protecting herself. I understand that better than you might think." Dominic stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Elena, I have to tell you something. Something I should have said weeks ago." Her heart stuttered. "What is it? I love you." He said the words with the gravity of a man who did not use them lightly. "I know it is too soon. I know there are 1,000 reasons why this is complicated and probably doomed. But I love you. I have loved you since the morning you made me that hot chocolate and looked at me like I was just a tired man who needed warmth, not a monster to be feared. I love you, and I do not care who knows." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were different from the tears she had cried all those weeks ago. These were tears of joy, of hope, of a heart finally allowing itself to believe in something beautiful. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have loved you since that first morning, when you walked into my café and looked at me like I was worth seeing." Dominic cupped her face in his hands and kissed her beneath the Christmas lights, snowflakes beginning to fall around them like a blessing from heaven. It was the most romantic moment of Elena's life, and she memorized every detail. The warmth of his lips, the strength of his hands, the scent of his cologne mixing with the crisp winter air. The feeling that finally, after all the years of loneliness and doubt, she had found where she belonged. If this story is touching your heart, if you believe that love can find us when we least expect it and transform everything we thought we knew, please leave a comment below saying, "Love found me in the most unexpected place." Share your own story of unexpected connection, and let us celebrate together the magic that happens when two souls recognize each other across the noise of the world. The new year arrived with fresh snow and fresh challenges. Elena stood at her cafe window, watching the white flakes drift down to blanket the city streets, feeling both the peace of the moment and the underlying tension that had been building since Christmas. Dominic's brother Marco had made good on his threats. He had reached out to certain federal contacts, suggesting that if the Marchetti family's transition to legitimacy was not proceeding quickly enough, perhaps government intervention might be necessary. The veiled threat had forced Dominic to accelerate his timeline dramatically, which in turn had created ripples throughout his organization. Not everyone was pleased. Men who had built their lives around the old ways suddenly found themselves being pushed out or redirected. Partnerships that had been profitable for decades were being dissolved. Power structures that had stood for generations were crumbling, and those who benefited from the old system were not going quietly. Elena tried to maintain her normal routine, opening the cafe each morning and serving her customers with the same warmth she always had. But she was aware now of things she had not noticed before. The men who sat in parked cars watching the street, the new security system Dominic had insisted on installing. The subtle increase in foot traffic from men she did not recognize, but who nodded to her with a respect that made clear they were Dominic's. She was being protected. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. One morning in late January, a man Elena did not recognize entered the cafe. He was younger than Dominic, perhaps in his mid-30s, with sharp features and cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they touched. He ordered an espresso and took a seat near the window, watching the street with the same predatory patience she had observed in Dominic that first morning. When Elena brought his drink, he smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. "You must be Elena, the woman who has captured the heart of Dominic Marchetti." Elena felt ice spread through her veins, but she kept her voice steady. "I am Elena. Can I help you with something? I am Vincent Caruso. We share a name, interestingly enough. Though we are not related, I assure you." Vincent's smile sharpened. "I am a business associate of your boyfriend, or at least I was, until he decided to dismantle everything we have built together." "I do not know anything about Dominic's business," Elena said carefully. "No, I am sure you do not. That is part of your charm, is it not? The innocent cafe owner who has nothing to do with the empire she is attached to." Vincent took a sip of his espresso. "The problem, Elena, is that innocence does not protect you. Not in our world. And Dominic should have known better than to put you in this position." Elena's hands trembled slightly, but she clasped them behind her back to hide it. "Is that a threat? It is a statement of fact." Vincent set down his cup and rose from his seat. "Tell your boyfriend that his timeline is unacceptable. Tell him that there are people who have invested too much to be pushed aside without compensation. And tell him that if he thinks his new legitimate enterprises will protect him from the consequences of his decisions, he is gravely mistaken." He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "You seem like a nice woman, Elena. It would be a shame if you got caught in the crossfire." Then he was gone, leaving Elena shaking behind her counter with the taste of fear bitter in her mouth. She called Dominic immediately. He arrived within 20 minutes, his expression thunderous as she recounted the conversation. "Vincent Caruso is a snake," Dominic said, pacing the length of the empty cafe. "He has been trying to undermine me since I took over from my father. This is just another tactic." "But is he dangerous?" Elena asked. Dominic stopped pacing and met her eyes. "He is desperate. And desperate men do desperate things. Should I be worried?" He crossed to her and took her hands, his grip firm and reassuring. "I will not let anything happen to you. I have already increased security. I am going to assign someone to watch the cafe during business hours. You will not see them, but they will be there. Dominic, this is my home, my business. I cannot live under siege. It will not be forever." He raised her hands to his lips and kissed them. "I am handling Vincent and the others. The transition will be complete by summer. After that, there will be no more shadows, no more threats. Just you and me and Sophia, and whatever future we choose to build together." Elena wanted to believe him. She wanted it with every fiber of her being. But the fear that Vincent had planted was not so easily uprooted. It grew in the corners of her mind, whispering warnings about the cost of loving a man with Dominic's past. The following weeks were tense. Elena went through the motions of her daily life, but she was hyper-aware of everything around her. Every unfamiliar face that entered the cafe, every car that seemed to linger too long on the street, every creak and groan of her old building at night. She threw herself into painting again, using the new supplies Dominic had given her. The canvas became her refuge, the only place where she could lose herself completely and forget the complications of her new reality. She was working on a portrait of Dominic, trying to capture the complexity of a man who was both dangerous and tender, both powerful and vulnerable. Sophia came to visit during her winter break, and to Elena's surprise, the girl sought her out at the cafe. She arrived one afternoon with a portfolio of her own artwork, shyly asking if Elena would look at it and give her honest feedback. They spent 3 hours together, poring over Sophia's paintings and discussing technique and composition. The girl had genuine talent, a natural eye for light and shadow, that reminded Elena of her own work at that age. By the time Sophia left, something had shifted between them. Not quite friendship yet, but the foundation for something that could grow into it. "She is different around you," Dominic observed that evening, when Elena told him about the visit. "Softer. More. Open. I have not seen her like that since before her mother died. She just needs someone to see her," Elena said. "Really see her. Not as your daughter or as a Marchetti heir, just as Sophia." Dominic pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "You see everyone, Elena. It is your gift. It is why I fell in love with you." February brought unexpected warmth and an equally unexpected visitor. Elena was closing the café one evening when a woman appeared at the door. She was elegant and severe, dressed in designer black from head to toe, with silver hair swept back from a face that had once been beautiful and now carried the architecture of age with dignity. "Elena Caruso," the woman said. It was not a question. "Yes, I am Isabella Marchetti, Dominic's mother." Elena felt her breath catch. Dominic had told her his mother died when he was 18. But before she could respond, the woman smiled slightly. "I see my son has been creative with the truth. I am not surprised. He has always been protective." She stepped inside the cafe uninvited and looked around with appraising eyes. "My husband died when Dominic was 18. I withdrew from society afterward and have lived privately ever since. But I am very much alive, and I have been watching my son fall in love with you from a distance. I do not understand," Elena managed. "Why would he lie? Because I asked him to." Isabella settled into a chair as though she had every right to be there. "My husband was a difficult man. After his death, I needed to disappear from the world he had created. But I never disappeared from my son's life. I have simply stayed in the shadows. And you are here now because I needed to see for myself who has captured Dominic's heart." Isabella's dark eyes, so like her son's, studied Elena intently. "He has loved only one woman before you, his wife, Maria. When she died, I was certain he would never allow himself to love again. Yet here you are." Elena did not know how to respond. The evening had taken a surreal turn that left her grasping for solid ground. "Sit down, child," Isabella gestured to the chair across from her. "I am not here to frighten you. I am here to understand you, and perhaps to warn you about what you are walking into." Elena sat, her legs suddenly weak. "What do you mean, warn me? My son is a good man who has done questionable things." Isabella's voice was matter-of-fact. "He inherited an empire he did not want and has spent years trying to dismantle it without destroying himself in the process. But there are people who will not let him go easily, people who see his transition as a betrayal, people who would hurt anyone he loves to force his hand." "Vincent Caruso," Elena said, "among others." Isabella nodded. "Vincent is the most immediate threat, but he is not the only one. The world my husband built was held together by fear and mutual benefit. Remove those foundations, and the whole structure becomes unstable. Dominic is trying to manage that instability, but there will be chaos before there is peace." Elena felt the weight of those words settle into her bones. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know what you have chosen, and because I see something in you that I have not seen in any of the women who have tried to reach my son over the years. I see strength, genuine strength, not the kind that comes from wealth or status, but the kind that comes from surviving loss and choosing to remain open despite it." Isabella leaned forward, her eyes intense. "My son needs that strength, Elena. The months ahead will test him in ways he cannot anticipate. He will need someone beside him who can hold steady when everything else is falling apart. Can you be that for him?" Elena thought about the question seriously, considering everything she had learned, everything she had experienced, everything she was risking by loving Dominic Marchetti. The fear was real. The danger was real. But so was the love, and Elena had spent too many years letting fear make her decisions. "Yes," she said finally, "I can be that for him." Isabella smiled, and the expression transformed her severe features into something warm and almost kind. "Good. Then welcome to the family, Elena Caruso. I hope you survive it. She rose and walked toward the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. One more thing. Do not tell Dominic I came. He would only worry, but know that I am watching. And if you ever need help that he cannot provide, there are ways to reach me. Then she was gone, disappearing into the February evening like a ghost. Elena stood alone in her cafe, surrounded by the familiar scent of coffee and the unfamiliar weight of secrets. She had entered Dominic's world expecting complications. She had not expected an alive mother or veiled warnings about chaos to come, but she had made her choice and she would stand by it. Whatever came next, she would face it with her eyes open and her heart unguarded. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was love. Spring arrived in New York with its characteristic drama, alternating between warm sunlight and sudden storms that left the streets glistening. Eleanor marked the changing season by the shift in her cafe's offerings, adding iced drinks to the menu and opening the windows to let fresh air circulate through the small space. Her relationship with Dominic had deepened over the winter months, settling into a rhythm that felt both passionate and domestic. He still arrived for coffee each morning, but now he often stayed to help with the breakfast rush, charming elderly customers and intimidating impatient ones with equal facility. In the evenings, they alternated between her apartment and his estate, building a shared life piece by piece. Sophia had become a regular fixture in Elena's world as well. The girl visited whenever she could escape boarding school, and she had begun painting alongside Elena in the small studio space that Dominic had helped convert from Elena's unused storage room. Their shared love of art had blossomed into genuine affection, and Elena found herself looking forward to Sophia's visits with the same anticipation she felt for Dominic's. But beneath the surface of this growing happiness, tension continued to build. Dominic's transition was proceeding on schedule, but the resistance had not diminished. There had been incidents, a fire at one of his warehouses that was ruled arson but never solved, a threatening letter delivered to Marco's home, a break-in at the estate that was interrupted by security before anything was taken. Dominic handled each event with characteristic control, but Elena could see the strain wearing on him. The shadows under his eyes deepened, his moments of distraction increased. Sometimes she caught him staring out windows with an expression that mixed determination with exhaustion. One morning in April, everything changed. Elena was preparing the cafe for opening when the front window exploded inward. She screamed and dropped to the floor as glass rained down around her, her ears ringing from the impact. When she looked up, she saw a brick lying amid the shattered remains, a piece of paper wrapped around it with a rubber band. Her hands shook as she unwrapped the message. The words were typed in bold capital letters, "Leave him or lose everything." Within minutes, the cafe was swarming with men she recognized as Dominic's security team. They secured the perimeter, swept for additional threats, and began cleaning the damage with efficient coordination that suggested they had done this before. Dominic arrived shortly after, his face pale with a fury that made Eleanor's blood run cold. She had seen him powerful. She had seen him tender. She had never seen him like this, barely contained violence radiating from every line of his body. He crossed to her immediately, cupping her face in his hands and scanning her for injuries. "Are you hurt? Elena, talk to me. I am fine, just shaken." She pressed her face into his chest, breathing in his familiar scent and letting it ground her. It was just a brick through the window. Just a brick. Dominic's voice was rough. "This is a message, a warning, and it is unacceptable." He pulled back and looked at her, his grey eyes blazing. "I want you to come stay at the estate just until this is resolved. The security there is better, and I cannot focus on handling Vincent if I am worried about you being vulnerable here." Part of Elena wanted to refuse, to insist, on her independence and her right to live her own life without cowering, but the brick had terrified her. The message had terrified her, and the thought of being away from Dominic while danger swirled around them both was more than she could bear. "Okay," she said, "I will come." Relief washed across his features. "Thank you. I know this is not what you signed up for. I signed up for you." Elena touched his face gently. "All of you, including this." The move to the estate happened quickly. Elena packed essentials and left her cafe in the hands of Rosa, a trusted employee who had been with her since the beginning. She would continue to visit daily to oversee operations, but her nights would now be spent within the protected walls of the Marchetti compound. Living at the estate was a revelation. For all its grandeur, the house felt surprisingly warm and welcoming. Elena settled into a suite of rooms adjacent to Dominic's, decorated in soft creams and blues that she suspected he had chosen, specifically for her. Sophia's room was down the hall, and though the girl was usually away at school, her presence in the house made it feel more like a home than a fortress. The days settled into a new pattern. Elena would go to the cafe in the mornings, escorted by security but otherwise maintaining her normal routine. Afternoons were spent at the estate, painting in the light-filled sunroom that Dominic had converted into a studio for her. Evenings were shared meals, quiet conversations, and the slow building of a life together. But the threat of Vincent and his allies remained constant. There were meetings Elena was not part of, phone calls that made Dominic's jaw clench, and visits from hard-eyed men who spoke in lowered voices about things she did not want to know. She understood that Dominic was waging a war on her behalf, fighting to protect both their future and his transition to legitimacy. One evening in late April, Dominic came to her studio with news that made her heart. "Stop. Vincent has been neutralized," he said. Elena looked up from her canvas, her brush still in hand. "What does that mean?" "Neutralized. It means he will not be threatening you again, or anyone else." Dominic's expression was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. He made some very poor decisions involving federal investigators who were already watching him. Those decisions have consequences that will keep him occupied for the next 15 to 20 years. Elena processed this slowly. "Federal investigators? You mean he was arrested?" "I mean that evidence of his various activities found its way into the hands of people who could not ignore it." Dominic's mouth curved slightly. Sometimes the system works as it is supposed to. When given the proper motivation, she understood then what he was not saying. Dominic had not killed Vincent. He had destroyed him using legitimate means, turning the tools of law enforcement against a man who had threatened everything Dominic was trying to build. It was elegant. It was ruthless, and it was the kind of justice that did not require Elena to compromise her conscience. "Is it over then?" she asked. "Not entirely. There are still loose ends. People who supported Vincent who need to understand that his path leads nowhere. But the immediate threat to you is gone." Dominic crossed the room and took her paint-stained hands in his. "You can move back to your apartment if you want. The danger has passed." Elena looked at him, at this man who had entered her cafe 6 months ago and turned her entire world upside down. She thought about her small apartment above the bakery, the independence she had fought so hard to maintain, the life she had built from the ashes of her failed marriage. Then she thought about waking up beside Dominic every morning, about shared dinners and quiet evenings, and the feeling of belonging that had been absent from her life for so long. "What if I do not want to move back?" she said softly. "What if I want to stay here, with you?" Something in Dominic's expression shifted, a vulnerability appearing that made him look young and hopeful despite everything he had been through. "You would do that. I would do anything for you." Elena stepped closer, rising on her toes to press her forehead against his. "I love you, Dominic. I love the life we are building together. I do not want to go back to being alone." He pulled her into his arms and held her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Then stay," he murmured against her. "Hair, stay forever." She intended to do exactly that. Summer arrived with warmth and possibility, and with it came the completion of Dominic's transition. The last of the problematic partnerships had been dissolved. The final questionable enterprises had been either shut down or converted to legitimate operation. The Marchetti family, for the first time in 3 generations, was entirely legal. The celebration was held at the estate on a warm evening in June, a gathering of family and close associates who had supported the transition and would help build the new future. Elena stood at Dominic's side throughout the evening, greeting guests and accepting congratulations as though she had always belonged there. Sophia was home for the summer, and she had brought 2 friends from school who were appropriately awed by the grandeur of the Marchetti estate. Watching the girls laugh and splash in the pool, Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. This was her family now, complicated and imperfect, marked by darkness and reaching toward light, but hers. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Dominic led Elena to the garden where they had shared their first kiss on Christmas Eve. The roses were in full bloom now, filling the air with fragrance, and fairy lights wound through the arbors created a magical glow in the gathering dusk. "I have something to ask you," Dominic said, his voice unusually nervous. Elena's heart began to race. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. When he opened it, Elena gasped. Inside lay a ring of antique gold, set with a sapphire the color of the Mediterranean Sea, surrounded by small diamonds that caught the light like stars. "This was my grandmother's," Dominic said. "She gave it to my grandfather on their 50th anniversary, told him it represented all the years they had weathered together. I have been waiting to find someone worthy of wearing it." He lowered himself to one knee, looking up at her with eyes that held no reservation, no calculation, nothing but pure and overwhelming love. "Elena Caruso. You walked into my life when I had convinced myself that love was no longer possible. You saw past the darkness to the man underneath. You gave me hope when I had forgotten what hope felt like. You have become my home, my heart, my reason for wanting to build something better." He took her trembling hand in his. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the faith you have placed in me? Will you be my wife?" Tears streamed down Elena's face, but she was smiling so widely her cheeks ached. "Yes," she managed to say through her joy. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." Dominic slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her. Then he rose and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her as they both laughed with pure, uncomplicated happiness. From the house, Elena heard a squeal of excitement. She looked up to see Sophia watching from the terrace, her face split by a grin that held no reservation. Finally the girl called out, "I thought he would never get around to asking." Dominic set Elena down and turned toward his daughter, one arm still wrapped firmly around his future wife's waist. "Your approval is noted." "More than approval," Sophia said, descending the terrace steps to join them. She reached Elena and wrapped her in a hug that was warm and genuine. "Welcome to the family." Officially, Eleanor hugged her back, this prickly, protective, secretly tender girl who had become so important to her. "Thank you, Sophia, for accepting me. You make my father happy." Sophia pulled back and smiled. "And you make really excellent hot chocolate. That is enough for me." The 3 of them stood together in the rose garden as the last light of day faded into a summer night filled with stars. Eleanor looked at the ring on her finger, at the man beside her, at the girl who would become her stepdaughter. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a broken marriage and a shattered sense of self to this moment of absolute belonging. A year ago she had believed that love was not for her anymore. She had been certain that her chance at happiness had passed, that she was destined to live out her days in quiet loneliness, finding what satisfaction she could in her café and her customers, but never again experiencing the profound connection of romantic love. She had been so wrong. Love had found her in the most unexpected place, in the form of a dangerous man with sad eyes who had waited for her every morning simply for the privilege of being in her presence. It had demanded that she be brave, that she take risks, that she open her heart even when every instinct screamed at her to protect herself, and it had rewarded that courage with a joy so complete that it still took her breath away. "What are you thinking about?" Dominic asked, softly, watching her with the attentive gaze she had come to treasure. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," Elena replied. "For you, for Sophia, for this life we are building together. I am thinking about how close I came to missing all of this because I was too afraid to take a chance." Dominic pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You were never going to miss it. I would not have let you. From the moment I walked into your cafe, I knew you were meant to be mine. I would have waited, forever if necessary." Fortunately, Elena smiled up at him. "You did not have to wait that long." He laughed, the sound rich and free, and kissed her properly under the stars, while Sophia made gagging noises in the background and then wandered back to the house to give them privacy. "This is just the beginning," Dominic murmured against Eleanor's lips. "We have so much ahead of us. The wedding, growing old together, grandchildren someday, a whole lifetime of mornings where I get to wake up beside you." Elena pulled back slightly, her eyes shining. "That sounds perfect." "You are perfect," he corrected. "Everything else is just bonus." They walked back to the house hand in hand, their future stretching before them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. There would be challenges ahead, Elena knew. Life was never simple, and the shadows of Dominic's past would not disappear entirely just because he had walked away from them. But they would face those challenges together, supporting each other, believing in each other, loving each other through whatever came. 6 months ago, Eleanor had opened her cafe on an ordinary November morning with no expectation that anything would change. Then a man in a charcoal overcoat had walked through her door and asked for black coffee, and nothing had been ordinary since. It was the best thing that had ever happened to her. If you have watched this far, it is because this story has touched something in your heart. You have traveled with Elena from loneliness to love, from fear to hope, from believing that happiness was no longer possible, to embracing a future filled with promise. That connection matters. That is what brings us together as a community of dreamers who believe that love can find us at any age, in any circumstance, when we least expect it. Please leave a comment below saying, "I watched this far." Let me know you are there. Let me see who really enjoys these stories and connects with these characters. Your comments mean the world to me, and help more people find these stories that are made with love for an audience that deserves to believe in happy endings. If this story moved you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Your likes tell the algorithm that this content is worth sharing, and they help more people discover these journeys of love and redemption that we create together. And if you have not already, please subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Every week brings a new adventure, a new couple finding their way to each other against all odds, a new reminder that it is never too late for love. Finally, if you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone who has given up on finding happiness, someone who believes their chance has passed, please share this video with them. You never know whose heart might be opened by a story like Elena and Dominic's. You never know whose life might be changed by the reminder that love is always possible. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, remember, love found Elena in a coffee cup handed across a counter on an ordinary Tuesday morning. It can find you too, wherever you are, whenever you are ready. Stay open, stay hopeful. Stay in love with possibility.